I am Felicia Tomasco, and I work at the Center for Religion and Spirituality at Loyola Marymount University. And welcome to this conversation, this podcast, Yoga in Our Time. And I am super stoked to be here in conversation today with Matthew Remski. And Matthew is a noted teacher, writer, author, and general just person who brings so much critical thinking and thoughtfulness and is very provocative. And I am just honored to be able to have this time to have a conversation today about yoga in our time. So thank you so much, Matthew.
Thanks, Felicia. It's a real pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. And I know you just finished a class at the Yoga Mindfulness and Social Change course that is offered through the Center for Religion and Spirituality. And in this course, there's a lot of conversations that happen about yoga in the modern world and various aspects of yoga and what they mean in terms of social change, in terms of mindfulness, and all of these things. And I know one of your areas of interest, expertise, and that you write about often is abuse and cult dynamics. And this seems so relevant in the world we live in today and such an important topic. And where would you begin in terms of just educating people who maybe don't think that this is something that they've ever been exposed to in terms of what they need to look for related to, say, abuse or cult dynamics in any community that they may be involved in?
Well, I think it's a great place to start. And I tried to lay a sort of basic framework for answering that general question out in an article that I recently posted to Medium that maybe we can give the link to. And it opens by quoting Shannon Roach, who at that time was the COO of Yoga Alliance in 2018 when she released this video, which was kind of as the Me Too movement in the yoga world was reaching a kind of crest, a critical mass. And she was involved in shepherding the Yoga Alliance updated sexual misconduct policy into for the membership. And she said in a video, which was kind of stunning to hear from one of the leaders of the top yoga nonprofits in the world, in the English-speaking world. The quote is, "There's a deeply troubling pattern of sexual misconduct within our community, a pattern that touches almost every tradition in modern yoga." And I really sort of flashed on that phrase, almost every tradition, and was happy to hear the acknowledgement that abuse, and specifically, she doesn't use this term, but I would say institutional abuse, is not a bug. It's not a matter of bad apples within the yoga world. It's kind of a feature of charismatically led organizations. And I think for most people who have professionalized into the yoga world, they are within a few, what do you call it? A few orders of separation only away from a school or an organization that has an unresolved abuse crisis that necessarily involves a kind of structural element to it. And that's where I think the discourse of cultic dynamics is really useful in examining how these things work and the patterns that are involved, because the list is extensive. I would argue that we've seen cultic dynamics and revelations in the global Ashtanga yoga world, in the Shivananda yoga world, in the Iyengar yoga world, in the Bikram yoga world, in the Kundalini yoga world. There's very few major branded schools or corporations that don't have to deal with this particular shadow, and I'm very saddened by it. I'm a survivor of cultic dynamics, so there's a lot of personal history wrapped up in this. But I'm saddened by it for all of the suffering that I have learned about and reported on and interviewed people about. But at the same time, I think we're in kind of an amazing golden age of cult literature, really,
Mhm.
in which a lot of the dynamics are slowly sort of coming to the surface. Then there's a question of accountability and reform, which is a long road. But yeah, I think that the problem is pervasive. Everybody understands that it's pervasive. Everybody who's professionalized into the yoga world has some kind of connection with an institutional abuse issue. That means that most people's education is in some way compromised, morally compromised by that. And so, yeah, there's some work to do.
In thinking about that and thinking about what you just said about most people's yoga education is morally compromised in some way,
Yeah.
do you think it's still possible to be a practitioner of yoga in this modern day and age and believe in the teachings?
Yeah, I absolutely do, but I think it takes a really clear eye focused on how yoga communities and businesses, and the distinction between those two things is really actually kind of vague, have done a terrible job at protecting students from the abuses of charismatic leaders and their lieutenants. And I think without looking at that really clearly and about how and at how that works and what some of the dominance hierarchy pressures are involved in setting up those organizations, how they end up getting led, what ends up getting projected onto the leader, how the leaders are enabled, without looking at those in real detail, I think that it's very easy for um, uh, abuse issues to become intergenerational, as we've already seen. Um, and so, uh, is it possible? Yeah, it is, but I think you've got to learn your history and really not repeat it. And I think that on a functional level, very practical terms, the key question that people who want to ethically professionalize and practice within modern yoga have to really grapple with is, what kind of accountability structures are they going to submit to? And what does it mean to have a scope of practice? And what does it mean to recognize that maybe you were inspired to start practicing yoga by somebody who had a fair amount of charisma, but to recognize as well that charisma is not a predictor of ethics or competence. So, yeah, there are. I think it's possible, definitely, but it really requires thinking much more sort of locally, small scale, um, to recognize that most of the large yoga organizations with unresolved abuse histories are really corporations in terms of their size, uh, and but without the sort of like modern benefits of boards of directors or like HR departments that help to bring some kind of business accountability to the table, and to recognize that, um, as an unregulated, maybe this is at the key to at the heart of it too, is that if one recognizes that to become well known as a yoga teacher in the modern era, the currency of the realm has been charisma instead of competency, then I think that those who wish to have ethical community should look that squarely in the eye and see what it actually means. Because um, when a profession is both as aspirational and as unregulated as yoga is, what would stop the power of charisma and the power that accrues to it?
I think you brought up such an interesting point around charisma is not necessarily going to be indicative of competence or ethics,
No,
right? And we
not at all.
really look at what ethics are, and we really look at things like organizations and corporations, and even the world we're living in right now, where we're reevaluating as humanity what does it mean to treat each other in specific ways? So corporations are rethinking these kinds of things, governments are
Right.
rethinking these kinds of things, communities are rethinking these kinds of things. And within yoga, our communities, our corporations, as it were, the importance of, how do we implement these kinds of human resource ethics questions? How do we also incorporate critical thinking and questioning into a system that there is an aspect of you don't question the guru? So these are all these dynamics that are at play and are converging in the world today around these questions. So how would you suggest that modern yoga communities, and as we are saying modern, moving into the future, right, being able to operate not just in the 20th century but into the 21st century with ethics, how do you suggest that communities put some kind of ethical accountability structure, a human resources department, as it were, into place?
You know, full disclosure, I was hired as one of the consultants for the Yoga Alliance. What do they call it? The renewal or the new standards project or something
Mhm.
like that. So that unfolded over a couple of years. And uh, the third rail of modern yoga politics is regulation. And at a certain point, my best argument presented to my colleagues was, um, okay, so in 1992, a full investigative journalism piece about Manuso Manos and his alleged behaviors, his sexual abuse behaviors in San Francisco, was published by the San Jose Mercury News.
Yes.
Uh, it was several thousand words. It went unchallenged by Manos or anybody involved. There were no corrections made to it. I interviewed the original journalist, uh, and so I said to my colleagues, if there had been a license for teaching yoga in the state of California in 1992, Manuso Manos would have lost it. How would he have gotten it back? Well, that would have been for the licensing board to decide. But there isn't such a thing. So it was left up to the Iyengar Institute, which fired him for 9 months, and then BKS Iyengar reinstated him because he was the golden child of the organization. Uh, and so there was, profound personal relationship there, and there's all of that politics and stuff. But there was nothing to sort of like, um, uh, in any kind of there was no real moral framework for how to reingratiate this person, to retrain them, to uh, send them to whatever help they needed. There was no evaluation. There was nothing that you would get in any of the caring professions that actually want to do things like get into schools and become adjunct therapies for healthcare systems. Like there's this desire within the yoga world to legitimize and professionalize, but none of the real sort of desire to do the legwork and to hold each other's feet to the fire with regard to what it would take, which would mean there has to be some sort of way of um, depriving a person from the capacity to call themselves a yoga teacher in a jurisdiction. Anyway, so fast forward 20 years later, or however long it is, 25 years later, and I say, uh, you have to come up with an argument for why it was okay that he was allowed to come back to teach yoga in the state of California. And then, of course, more allegations followed because this behavior is patterned, it's repetitive. We expect it to return. We don't expect people to reform themselves. Um, and so there's no answer for that question. It's like, to me, that's a moral baseline. It's like, are you okay with the fact that there was no sort of collective professional way to say you can't teach yoga here anymore in this jurisdiction? Are
Right.
you okay with not having had that power, not having taken the responsibility for each other and for your students? And basically, the answer from almost everybody was, well, we see the problem, but no, we're not really. I don't think the industry is ready for that. I don't think that it gets into really tricky territory of well, can we even define this thing that we're going to then license, and all of those problems follow. But these are all of the same questions that licensed psychotherapists had to deal with when they began to professionalize. All of the same problems that anybody in any caring profession has had to do as they've moved into professional accountability.
Well, that's very true. And we can look toward other professions and even other healing professions and helping professions
Mhm.
for examples of how to follow an ethical framework and address reporting or
Right.
address support for people who say have been affected by the trauma of abuse.
Right. Right. We definitely can. And I think there's almost like there's two things going on, and I'm speaking to you from Toronto, so as a Canadian, but I'm also a dual citizen, so I feel I'm okay I can take a shot here, which is that um, so much of this discussion is dominated by um, an American, very, I would say, not all the way. It moves towards a libertarian sort of outlook on, keep the government out of my religion, my spirituality, my wellness practice. So there's a political bias there behind the sort of main driving culture within modern yoga, which happens to be American, and that's complicated by the fact that you know American governmentality is neglectful, and it doesn't it doesn't support its citizens, and it doesn't offer universal health care. And so you know people in the States legitimately turn to yoga as a sort of primary source of health and wellness care. And in the absence or in the disillusionment of their traditional religions, they turn to it for spiritual support as well, and they carve out that space very independently from the notion of regulation, governmentality, and the accountability that goes along with it. And so I always have this kind of there's always this sort of like threshold that we come to in the discussion of, well, how professional can this get, and how many sort of group agreements can we actually forge around what we're doing in these spaces, and that threshold is really determined by a kind of American individualism, I would say, with regard to how private yoga feels to them, to practitioners in the States. It's different. It's a little bit different here. It's definitely different in England. I'll never forget, and the rest of Northern Europe, but I'll never forget, um, uh, talking to. This all came home to me when I interviewed an Ashtanga practitioner who was self-employed, and in the 1990s, uh, really sort of destroyed her shoulder doing the third series of whatever, and as she was trying to recover, she was self-employed. She was not medically insured. As she was trying to recover, her instructors told her that she should continue doing the primary series of Ashtanga yoga because it was called therapy for the body. And so she kept doing that, and of course, it didn't hurt a catastrophically, it didn't help a catastrophically injured shoulder, but she didn't feel that she had any kind of choice because there wasn't medical help forthcoming, and she had been sort of inculcated with this value that the environment and the practice should provide for all of her needs. And so I think stories like that are really at the root of, well, what do you mean you're going to regulate this space? Well, what do you mean there's going to be standards and we're going to have to agree on the definitions of terms? It's very tricky territory.
Well, it's very tricky territory. And I think there's an interesting just dynamic in modern yoga where there is, and speaking as an American or practicing yoga in America, where you're talking about this individuality and individualization of the practice and privacy of it, combined with this guru tradition, and
Right.
that you do what the guru says, and the charismatic leader. So you have these convergence of these factors that lead to an exacerbation of sort of the worst shadow sides of some of these things.
I'm glad that you tied those things together because the more the practitioner is imbued with a sense of, this is my personal journey, this is my practice, or this is my karma to work out, or this is my this is my particular expression of how yoga is flowing through my being, or whatever, the more atomized that practitioner feels themselves to be in relation to a powerful figure, in relation to a dominant or charismatic figure. And it really leads to a kind of fragmentation of community, in the sense that people are kind of all doing yoga together, but very, very separately, and in some cases being told, I mean, I don't, I've brought up Ashtanga already, but I don't want to pick on a particular community, but one example I think is really important. One of the things that allowed Pattabhi Jois to assault students basically every day of his working life was not only his instruction, but the community members' belief that they had to stay within their own experience, even unfocus their eyes, look straight ahead, and keep drishti on this or that or the other thing, and not dare to look around and recognize that they're in a room full of other people and they're sharing an experience. And that actually prevented them, in many cases, from seeing that he was abusing not only them, but other people in the room. And so it's kind of this peak example of, you have a personal relationship with your practice, with your body, and then a personal relationship with the charismatic leader that can't really be shared or described or spoken about, that is filled with either glory or shame, and so it can have that sort of schizoid quality to it as well. But in any case, you come out of the room and you're not really able to talk with each other about what happened. It's a very sort of mystical, private, sweaty thing, and who knows what really happened. And so, yeah, those things fold together. And I mean, that's very characteristic of cultic dynamics in general. Is that the relationships, the horizontal relationships in a group, have to be devalued, or put into sort of subservience to the relationship to the lieutenants, or the ideology, or the charismatic leader. So that's very common. That's pretty much like clockwork. There can't really be horizontal relationship between members of a high demand group, because that will challenge the intimacy that's demanded vertically, right?
Well, and that brings us to one of the questions that has come up from one of our, people watching us live right now, is this,
Right.
Relates to this very thing that you are talking about. How do I know if I'm in an abusive relationship with my teacher?
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so the first, I would say the first red flag, well, in my book, which I did plan on pushing, but
it's okay. Tell us.
My book about Ashtanga yoga finishes with this workbook section that details what I feel are 8 good practices
Mhm.
for recognizing cultic dynamics. And the first one is, um, do you recognize that you're in a situation of situational vulnerability? Like, not are you gullible? Are you going to fall for deception? Do you have a history of abuse in your past? Those might be factors that you want to be aware of, but you know, are you needing something from a group experience or from a leader that is that comes from a situation or a period, a temporary period in your life of vulnerability? Like, did you just get divorced? Did you have a medical issue? Did you lose a parent? Did you take a gap year from school? What's your level of sort of need in relation to a group? Um, then can you identify very strong feelings of transference and idealization? Right? Like, if somebody opens their mouth and you think, "Oh my God, I can't believe how true their speech is. I can't believe how beautiful they are. I can't believe how wise they are. They make me feel like I've never felt before." That can be really nice, and it's also that it's also a red flag, because human beings just really aren't that way for each other. uh, you know, people are complicated, and there's a blade hidden in that warm gush, which is that you're probably projecting some kind of idealized state or a transferred need onto the person.
Mhm.
Getting a little bit more into the behavior of the leader, uh, do they speak in jargon? Uh,
Mm.
is it specialized? Are they using words and phrases that you don't know the definition of, but somehow you feel that it just makes sense to you, and it seems to make sense to everybody else? And so you're just going to go with it, and you're kind of going to fake it until you make it. But you really have the sense that when this person speaks, it's like fantastically powerful, and they're telling the truth, and they're really opening you up. Um, but the test for this would be, get a transcript of one of the talks that they give that make you feel that way, and see what it looks like on paper, because chances are good, if it's filled with jargon, it'll just look like the dog's dinner. It'll look like crap. It won't it's if the person is not speaking as sort of intelligently on the page as they are in real life, or if there's a grave difference between those two things, it's probably that they're using word salad techniques that have as much to do with mesmerizing listeners as they do with communicating information.
Mhm.
Um, are they? Is there anybody in the room that can hold them accountable to their claims? So, good example here. The first cult that I was recruited into was run by a guy named Michael Roach, and he was a sort of neo-Tibetan Buddhist teacher, American. And he really impressed me by being able to recite apparently flawless, although how would I know? Tibetan medieval scripture, like line after line after line after line. It sounded like it was coming from another planet. And I was situationally vulnerable. I was a long way from home. My social ties were frayed. I was probably clinically depressed, and I didn't really have the wherewithal or the family culture to seek out therapy. And so, yeah, that was very impressive to me. And I didn't stop to ask myself, who can verify whether or not this guy is talking garbage or not? And it would have been tricky with him, because in some ways he wasn't, but in very, very specific ways he was. He preached its form of Tibetan Buddhism that was actually basically prosperity gospel, right?
Mhm.
It was about how to improve your relationships and how to get more money and all this weird stuff that became apparent later. That's not what attracted me, but it sort of came out in the wash. So, is there anybody who can call BS on the leader in the room? Who's qualified to do that? Um, Ostensibly, like, if you just compare that to an academic setting, if you're defending your thesis in front of a panel, there's going to be somebody in the room who can speak with expertise to, the subject matter that's being spoken about. Um, so ask you can ask yourself, who are the peer reviewers for this person,
Mhm.
right? Who are they accountable to? If they were to mess up, if they were to abuse a student, who would they get in trouble with? How would their livelihood or their capacity to teach or even their credibility be challenged, and be put up for evaluation? Um, and then there's things like, um, be aware of the fact that it's very, very common for human beings to begin to sense that something is off, and then to feel like, you know, this part of this works for me, and I'm not so sure about that stuff over there, and I'm kind of keep it at arm's length. And when that escalates into a cultic dimension, uh, I would call that I got mineism, and it's a primary kind of block to being able to look clearly at how a situation is being organized around you.
Mhm.
It's a form of individualistic thinking that says, well, if I'm getting something out of this, meditation or out of this asana sequence, then I don't really have to worry about, that person's experience so much. I know something is off there, but I'm going to stay in my practice. That's I got mineism. And to be, and not to shame anybody, but it's a selfish and very natural way of thinking about being in a group dynamic. I think many of us end up doing it. And if you find yourself like feeling that way, that you're going to sort of narrow down, keep your head down, and kind of get what you can out of this wonderful tradition, chances are good what you're really focused on is um, your own virtue, actually. You're focused on preserving your own virtue, the good stuff that you brought to the room, uh, and because whatever good you're getting out of the group, it has to do with you as well, right?
Yeah, it does have to do with you. And it's interesting because this conversation also relates to one of the questions that, another viewer has asked, which is, has the rise of fake news, especially on social media in the past few years, had a noticeable impact on yoga communities? And I think that,
Oh
this
wow, right.
question also relates to, this thing of how do we evaluate, right? How do we evaluate the teacher, and how do we stand up for each other, and all of it?
I would say that because cultic dynamics have been a feature of yoga communities instead of a bug over the last 40 years, the door was wide open for QAnon and conspirituality to walk all over various yoga communities and to tear a lot of people apart. Um, because the principles are the same, right? Uh, what the cult does, and what conspirituality or QAnon do, is they offer what I would call a form of disaster spirituality,
Mm.
which is something terrible is happening in the world, and this is so precious, and we're going to do this, and the sort of the tension between those two things is ratcheted up in times of crisis by the cultic group, but also by the kind of landscape of conspiracism that takes something like the pandemic and invents really all kinds of very pressurized solutions for it, that really don't have anything to do with epidemiology or public health or anything like that. So has the rise of fake news contributed to a kind of degradation of yoga community? I would say that the media chaos of the last year and a half has exploited an epistemic weakness within yoga communities. And that epistemic weakness is, how did we evaluate something that was true and safe to begin with, right? How did we tell the difference between peer-reviewed scholarship on the Yoga Sutras and somebody's aspirational hot take? How did we tell the difference between, you know, uh, Ayurveda as a pre-modern self-care practice that has some translatable benefit to the modern age and not something that's going to compete with vaccines? How did we answer these questions about what alignment means in terms of internal energy, or how did we assess the mystical body of pre-modern yoga, and do we still feel that we live there? Like, I think yoga people have been living with, one foot, like in Warrior 2, one foot in the laboratory and one foot in the Middle Ages for a long time. And so trying to figure out what is true or what is reasonable or what is consensus reality has always actually been a problem, and has made 2020 particularly unstable for the yoga world.
Well, and it's so interesting talking about all these factors and this kind of one foot in the present or the future and the one foot in kind of a medieval tradition. And this brings to mind too that in some interpretations of yoga, there is an aspect of reflection, observation, investigation, critical thinking. And it feels to me that maybe one of the answers to many of these questions, whether it's how do I know if I'm in an abusive relationship with my teacher, what does yoga mean in the modern world, is that for all of us, it's important to apply these questions of critical thinking and to look at how do we not just keep our eye on the teacher and the example that you gave, but also look toward each other in a
Yeah,
supportive way.
yeah, and also to recognize that the sources of social fragmentation are so incredibly efficient, and that they escalate and accelerate through time, and that, you know there's a political economy element too involved, that kind of hyper individualizes people in the yoga world, especially as they move towards professionalization, which is that, you know to make your mark, you are not only keeping your eye on the charismatic leader, but eventually you are meant to come to imitate them in some way through the extension of your own influence, and through the meditation upon, and perhaps creation of the aspirational self that you're going to put onto Instagram or onto Facebook. And so it's not just that, yoga people are looking in a kind of disempowered way at charismatic leaders, and perhaps also suffering from the self-esteem issues that come along with, my practice isn't good enough or whatever. They are also being encouraged, if they professionalize, to kind of create a projected, perfected self to present to the world performatively. Um, that's kind of the basis of the gig economy, right? Is to say, well, I'm presenting my best, most evolved self, and that's my product. And so there's this weird sort of like overlap between the supposed results of a life of meditation and contemplation and the aspirational self as a product that the yoga person is presenting to the world. And I think that has to be seen very, very clearly as well, too, so that, it's not just about checking out who are we following, but also like, what are we trying to become? Like,
Mhm.
what are how good or how perfected or how exalted or how visible are we trying to become? And I'm just, I'm mindful of the fact that there was no such thing as being visible as a yoga teacher or a yoga practitioner prior to the 1920s. And so we're living in this like sort of hyper visualized and performative environment in which it's very difficult to internalize, to check in, to say, okay, well, how am I really going to monitor how I'm feeling about something? And sometimes even becoming a grand intuitive is part of the aspirational self, and I think that rarely has to do with actually like really checking in and saying, is this space okay for me?
So I think that a good way to wrap this up is to think about this in terms of cult dynamics, in terms of questioning the teacher, in terms of all of these things. What you just said, is this space okay for me? And to really evaluate that. And for us, I think as a yoga community, for us as yoga practitioners, to also come from a place of what does it mean to support that type of inquiry?
Oh, for sure, especially for other people, because the sort of the other side of that question is it safe for the person beside me, right?
Yes.
And that's where we get into all of the our many unsolved issues around equity and diversity and inclusion. Because yeah, is this safe? Does this feel right to me? Is like the first half of the community question, and the second half of the community question is, do I imagine that this feels right for other people? And I don't know of, I actually haven't heard of a yoga school or community organization which anybody's been invited to ask that second question.
And maybe that's the question for the future, for our collective future as people who practice yoga and continue to believe in the practice of yoga, is how do we integrate that question of, is this place safe for myself and for others? How do we cultivate, how do we support community safety?
Yeah.
And maybe that's the challenge.
Yeah. And I think we can look to, I think we can look to very sort of straight-laced, tried and true, somewhat boring tools for figuring out how that works in other spaces. Scope
Mhm.
of practice, code of ethics, accountability systems, Robert's rules for meetings, peer review and support. Yeah. I mean, I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. I think that as yoga people, we have to maybe stop thinking that we don't need the wheel.
Right. And look toward where are the other human communities,
right,
where wheels have been built and we can
right.
model our work
Yeah.
in those ways. Well, Matthew, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for not only for this conversation and for participating in these conversations at Loyola Marymount University and Center for Religion and Spirituality and Yoga, Mindfulness, and Social Change, but for the work that you do in the world, because I think your voice is such an essential one, and your provocation of these questions, everything that you bring to the table, the page, the podcast, everywhere else that you share your thoughts is valuable and is part of how we can continue to ask each other these questions of what it means to really practice yoga in the modern world.
Thank you so much, Felicia. That's very kind.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you all. And we look forward to staying in touch in every possible way. And thank you again for joining us.